Breaking news, and I quote, make them riot. Those are the exact words of a Trump campaign operative in the days after the 2020 election. And that is according to a new 165-page detailed filing by the special counsel Jack Smith. It paints the fullest picture yet of the evidence that prosecutors have against Trump. Now, we learn a lot in this document, and among the new allegations is that Trump told his wife Melania, his daughter Ivanka, and his son-in-law Jared Kushner, quote, it doesn't matter if you won or lost the election. You still have to fight like hell. Evan Perez is out front. And Evan, lots of new revelations in this filing. I mean, even that sentence alone says so much. It doesn't matter if you won or lost. It's whether you're going to fight to get the outcome that you want is very clearly what's being said there. What else is in here?
Well, Aaron, this 165-page document is really the attempt by the special counsel to get over the very high hurdles that the Supreme Court put up to try to protect the former president, essentially shielding him from prosecution because of his immunity as president. And I'll read you just a part of what the case that Jack Smith, the special counsel, is making. He says that when the defendant lost the 2020 presidential election, he resorted to crimes to try to stay in office. And then they continue to say the defendant launched a series of increasingly desperate plans to overturn the legitimate election results in 7 states and lists those 7 states. And among the things we learned, Aaron, is the fact that, prosecutors say they have evidence that Donald Trump himself sent that now infamous 224 tweet, if you remember, on January 6th, where he told his supporters that Mike Pence didn't have the courage to essentially go along with his claims that there was fraud in the election, and essentially put the former vice president, the then vice president, in danger. What prosecutors lay out there, they say that they know there were only 2 people who could have sent that tweet, and they know that the other person, obviously have witnesses, that person did not send the tweet. Therefore, it was Donald Trump who himself sent that tweet. And of course, as a result of that, the former vice president was put in danger. They had to evacuate him. And in this document, we learn that one of the things that happens is the former president is sitting there for hours, hearing about the evacuation at the U.S. Capitol, and he's told that the vice president essentially is in danger, and his response is, so what? Again, part of what prosecutors are doing here, Aaron, is to try to get over this hurdle from the Supreme Court to prove, they say, that what Donald Trump did is not protected by immunity. Aaron?
And pretty incredible get to the detail of the 2 people who could have tweeted and how you can prove that it wasn't one, so then therefore it was the other. I mean, this is a level of detail that we simply have not seen before. All right, Evan Perez, thank you very much. So I want to go straight to the Harvard constitutional law professor Lawrence Tribe then. And Professor, you hear Evan going through what's in this document, incredibly detailed, 165 pages. These are new details that we are getting from Jack Smith. What stands out the most to you?
What stands out most clearly is that the Supreme Court, despite its effort to protect the former president and to erect a hurdle that was almost sky high, made clear that it is possible to overcome that hurdle by specific proof that the former president, in his capacity as office seeker, private capacity, rather than office holder, a governmental capacity, sought to overturn an election that he knew he had lost. What we have here is a mountain of evidence, a mountain taller than the highest hurdle erected by the court, making it very clear that Jack Smith has the goods. He has the receipts. The evidence is overwhelming. And to the extent that there is any overlap between public and private, it occurs in the very limited context of communications between the president and the vice president. Those communications, if they deal with the vice president's executive role, are within the sphere of immunity that can be overcome by proof that the evidence used would not endanger the presidency. But most of this doesn't even reach that area because most of it is communications with the vice president or about the vice president in his role as president of the Senate, which is not subject to this executive immunity. Now, I'm getting deeply into the weeds, but the point is that I cannot imagine a clearer case that meets the court's standard. And all we have to do is wait until after the election. If Donald Trump does not take the oath as president next January, this guarantees that he will go to trial. If he does take the oath, it doesn't matter how good a job Jack Smith has done, because Donald Trump will either pardon himself or pick an attorney general who will dismiss the charges. So this filing focuses our attention, as it should be focused anyway, on the forthcoming election.
It is incredible when you hear the words, so what, referring to the fact that at the time Vice President Pence's life was in danger, that was what Donald Trump said at that moment. I guess the question to you, Professor, when you read through this, and I know you say, that the mountain of evidence here is as high as it can possibly get, your Mount Everest. But could this case go to the Supreme Court again? Or do you view it as simply so black and white at this point that you know that it will get over the finish line?
No, it may well go to the Supreme Court again, but now, since it will go to the Supreme Court one way or another after the election rather than before, the clock will no longer be ticking. It will no longer matter that the court might drag it out the way it dragged out the original immunity case, because the speedy trial right will apply. They can't drag it out indefinitely, and there's no longer a looming election to worry about. That's the whole difference. Earlier, the Supreme Court was in a position to schedule a late argument, to render a late decision, to make sure that sending it back to Judge Chutkan would create still further delay, and that there would be no full trial before the November 5 election. That was imperative, and the court did Trump's bidding by stretching it out as far as it humanly could. Now that that is behind us, and it no longer matters whether the trial occurs in April of next year or in October of next year or even in perhaps 2026, this man is going to face justice unless he evades it by managing to get himself into the presidency again. That's what it's all about.
Professor Tribe, just one quick thing to you. Was there anything that just sort of made your jaw drop when you read this? I mean, you know so much of this, but this actually, it put quotes on things. It put actual interactions. It put names on it in ways that we had not seen before. Did that sort of, even after everything you've seen and known, was there anything that you sort of said, wow, when you looked at it?
I said wow about 25 times in a quick reading of this document. I bet there are another 25 that I will encounter when I read it without the pressure of having to get ready to talk to you at 7:20 Eastern time. There are lots of jaw-dropping things. You've named some of them. So what if the vice president is hung? It doesn't matter whether we won or lost. That's just a sampling. It's the tip of a horribly large and scary iceberg.
All right. Well, Professor Tribe, I appreciate it so much. I'm so glad you did. You did get through it and join me for this conversation. So thanks so much. And we'll speak, of course, very soon.
I know you have investigated Trump now for several years. Give us your analysis of Jack Smith's latest document, this brief. Did any of this new evidence that is contained there surprise you?
Well, there are a lot of new details that are really eye-popping, but the Supreme Court and the Trump defense basically invited the submission of this document, because what the Roberts Court did to try to placate Trump was to say, well, the president is essentially immunized for official acts, or presumptively immunized for official acts, but not for private unofficial acts. And what this document does is to go through step by step by step through every chapter of this assault on American democracy to show how Donald Trump was not acting in an official capacity to take care that the laws are faithfully executed, but rather acting like, at very best, a private candidate and really like an outlaw, like a tyrant attacking the constitutional system. And at every point, he engaged in what Jack Smith describes as deceit, fraud against the system, lying about the facts, lying about the law, and lying in a way that he knew to be a lie because he'd been told by all of the reputable lawyers, and indeed the official lawyers, don't go anywhere near this. This isn't right. You haven't won the election. You've lost the election. And yet he proceeded anyway to act in this private capacity to try to shake down election officials like Brad Raffensperger, to shake down Republican operatives and elected officials who he thought would be submissive to him, although they weren't. And then ultimately to try to convince Mike Pence, acting in his capacity as the convener of the joint session of Congress under the 12th Amendment, as the president of the Senate, to try to convince him that he had an absolute right just to nullify the Electoral College votes that had been sent in as part of these certificates of ascertainment by the governors, memorializing the votes of millions of people. And he was basically telling Pence, you can nullify that. You can vaporize the votes of millions of people. There's no problem with your doing that. And then they tried to force him to do it. And when he stood by his oath of office and Pence refused to back down, they unleashed the mob against him, which is why they broke into the Capitol. They injured dozens and dozens of our officers. They drove the members of the House and the Senate out of our chambers, and then they chased Pence out of the building. I mean, he was within 30 seconds or 45 seconds of being actually apprehended by the mob. And the whole point of it was to get him to overturn an election that Joe Biden had won by 7 million votes, 306 to 232 in the Electoral College.
So, Congressman, how much of an impact will this document, this thick 170-page document, actually have if this case likely won't go to trial before the upcoming November election that's coming up very, very soon? Have voters already, do you think, made up their minds about Trump's conduct back on January 6th?
Well, I think every citizen owes it to himself or to herself to read this document coming from Jack Smith, because it documents in meticulous detail and with a lot of new information that was not part of the January 6th Select Committee report, and that wasn't part of the impeachment trial against Donald Trump, how Trump was the one behind the whole plan to try to get different people in the American constitutional system to violate their oaths of office, whether it's state legislative officials or election officials in the states like Brad Raffensperger, or ultimately the president of the Senate, Mike Pence, who of course was also Donald Trump's vice president, but he wasn't acting as vice president when Donald Trump tried to shake him down and coerce him into doing this. And so what we have is the portrait of an outlaw, somebody who's attacking the entire constitutional system from the outside. And if he were actually trying to enforce the law, a point which is made very strongly here by Jack Smith, why didn't he actually try to get in touch with other election officials other than Republican Party operatives? How come he didn't go to other states other than the swing states that he needed to win? He was obviously acting for himself and for nobody else.
And I totally agree. It's a very, very compelling, extremely well-written document, this latest charge.
Former President Trump now reacting to the bombshell court filing from special counsel Jack Smith, who goes into so many new details about how Donald Trump allegedly committed crimes to undermine the 2020 election. Let's bring in CNN's Kristen Holmes. Kristen, what is former President Trump saying?
Well, look, unsurprisingly, he is denying everything, saying that it's a hoax and linking it to the election. So this is, again, the same playbook that we have seen. The only difference now is that we are actually 34 days from the election.
Right,
so
right.
we have this. He was saying it 2 years ago when he announced his his candidacy. So here's what he says. He wrote this on Truth Social. He says the release of this falsehood-ridden, unconstitutional January 6th brief immediately following Tim Walz's disastrous debate performance and 33 days before the most important election in the history of our country is another obvious attempt by the Harris-Biden regime to undermine and weaponize American democracy and interfere with the 2024 presidential election. He goes on to talk about Jack Smith, calling him names, saying the hand-picked prosecutor of the Harris-Biden DOJ and Washington, D.C. based radical left Democrats are hell-bent on continuing to weaponize the Justice Department in an attempt to cling to power. Then he says that this is all because of the fact that he is winning and that this is because Democrats want to stop him and Republicans from winning. As we've discussed, this has been his strategy for the last 2 years since he announced his candidacy, really even before that, because he was toying with the idea publicly of running for office again. The only difference now is the fact that we are so close to the election and the fact that the Trump team is very well aware that people might be tuning in for the first time. And some of these details that were reported in detail at the time or in the last 2 years are things they might not have heard. And one of the ones I just want to quickly get to is one that we just put out as we're going through this document. It was about Bill Barr and his decision to come forward against Donald Trump essentially stemmed from an appearance that he saw Donald Trump made where he was lying actively about the election. So it says here that then Attorney General Bill Barr decided in 2020 to publicly rebut President Donald Trump, or he was outgoing president's false claim that the election was rigged after watching Trump spread these lies on Fox News. These are the kind of details that, one, can be used against him in this campaign, saying these people who were the closest to you were watching you lie. They were coming out against you. This was your inner circle at the time, and they saw that you were wrongdoing. And two, for the American public to see that these people who were really at the time rallying around Donald Trump were watching this unfold in real time, thought that he was lying, thought that he was spreading these lies and that it was dangerous, and then were coming forward.
Yeah, that's an important thing for our viewers and for the American people to remember, is that the evidence for the alleged crimes outlined in this document comes from not just Republicans, but the most stalwart Trump-supporting Republicans who were still working for him at the end of his administration after that term. That's who provided this information and testimony.
And we also, we forget about this a lot because we think about Vice President Pence as so fractured from the former president and in his own, dimension now of the Republican Party. But one thing to pay attention to is that he was the most loyal Trump supporter. He stuck by him for 4 years. Yeah. And
until a bunch of Trump supporters tried to kill him.
Yes, exactly.
All right, Kristen Holmes, thanks so much.
A massive haul of evidence in Special Counsel Jack Smith's election subversion case against Donald Trump is now public after Judge Tanya Chutkan unsealed a redacted 170-page version. This is it, 170-page version, drawing a scathing response from the Trump campaign. Our political experts are joining us now with more analysis. And Karen Finney, let me start with you. This filing comes as the Harris campaign released a new ad from the VP debate on this topic last night. Watch this.
He is still saying he didn't lose the election. I would just ask that. Did he lose the 2020 election?
Tim, I'm focused on the future.
That is a damning non-answer. America, I think you've got a really clear choice of who's going to honor that democracy and who's going to honor Donald Trump.
So, Karen, I assume this ad that was released by the Harris campaign has renewed relevance right now, especially after this latest Jack Smith federal filing against Trump.
Well, absolutely. And not just for the reasons you might think. Look, a couple of things. Number one, there are many, many voters in this country who, it's hard for us to believe, really have not followed all the various lawsuits as closely as most of us who are obsessed with politics do. For those folks who, and a lot of people this is about the time they start to tune into the election and trying to think about, who they're going to vote for. It brings forth new details and reminds people that this actually is one of the issues, part of the baggage that Donald Trump comes with. But the second thing, as the ad really points out, Donald Trump has been consistently incapable of staying on message in his speeches, of talking policy. And this will give him all the more fodder to continue the grievance narrative, to go back to how unfair everything is. And again, I think that reminds voters that that's what going back to Donald Trump in the White House would look and feel like. And I do think that's going to turn off a lot of voters.
Scott Jennings is with us as well. Scott, in a recent CNN poll, voters said the economy is the most important issue in this campaign, but protecting democracy is a clear number two. So how could Jack Smith's accusing Trump in this with all these new details, accusing Trump specifically of having resorted to crimes, his words, resorted to crimes in the election schemes, impact the election?
Well, protecting democracy is important, although it means different things to different people. If you look inside some of the polling that we did and what you've seen in individual states, it's mixed. There was a survey out of Georgia recently where more people thought that Donald Trump would strengthen democracy than Kamala Harris. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag when you start to throw around the word democracy. My general view is that if you are a January 6th focused voter, you have already made up your mind on this, and no new evidence is going to persuade you off the position that you have taken. I still think Trump leads on the most important issue, the economy. He leads on immigration. He leads on foreign policy. That was from the CNN poll. Harris has maybe firmer ground on democracy and abortion. I don't think this filing is going to change that basic construct of the hills on which the campaigns are fighting.
Let me bring Frank Luntz into this conversation. Frank, people are already voting in some states, as you know. How could this new evidence against Trump resonate, you think, with voters?
Well, it's an interesting challenge because this is not what Trump wants to be talking about in the last month. And we know the impact that accusations like this, though not as serious, faced Hillary Clinton in 2016. So this is a challenge for him, but I would emphasize that every time that Donald Trump, and I'm sorry, Will, for my voice, but that every time that Donald Trump was indicted over the last 2 years, and it's been a lot, his polling numbers went up after those indictments because the American people think he's being victimized. They think that he's a target, and they don't like politics playing. They don't like using the law as a weapon. I think this hurts him overall, but I wouldn't be surprised if it just makes Trump voters even more determined and even more likely to vote in November.
Anna Navarro's with us as well. Anna, Jack Smith, in this new document against Trump, writes that Trump told family members, and I'm quoting now, "It doesn't matter if you won or lost the election, you still have to fight like hell," end quote. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it's very consistent with the Donald Trump that we know. It's not about the truth. It's about your version of the truth, and you repeating it so many times that you make it the truth. Look, as Frank just alluded to, in 2016, when James Comey released that letter about Hillary Clinton, there is no doubt that it had consequences. I think this is different because I think Trump voters, there is nothing that's going to change them. If 34 felonies haven't changed them, if hearing him boast about grabbing a woman didn't change them, I'm not sure that a letter by Jack Smith is going to change them. But what we have to remember is that this is not about Harris voters or Trump voters. This is not about never Trumpers. This is about a handful, a few thousand voters in 6 or 7 states. And what is going to make them vote? What is going to make them ultimately make up their mind? And I think this is a reminder of the criminality, the chaos, the lying that comes with Donald Trump. If you have Trump amnesia, these type of things may help cure you of that.
Karen, after the release of this major document here, and it's so long, so detailed, Trump took to his Truth Social account to blame Nancy Pelosi for January 6th. What's your reaction to that?
Of course he did, because that's what we've been hearing from him, at least when he can remember her name, because, you know, he got that mixed up earlier this year. He's going to blame everybody but himself. He never takes accountability for his own actions. And let's be very clear. The reason we are here, the reason this happened is because he was not satisfied with the truth, which was he lost the election in 2020 and was trying to find a way to hold on to power. He'll never accept that accountability. I just want to mention one quick thing from 2016, having been there with the Comey report. I agree with what Anna said in that for people who might be on the fence or just not sure, this is if they're looking for an excuse to not vote for Trump, this is that kind of excuse. This provides that for them.
We will see. Scott, Trump is also claiming he, quote, demanded that D.C. be protected, his words. But the filing reveals that when told of the danger, the actual danger that Vice President Mike Pence was facing on January 6th, Trump responded, and I'm quoting from the document, "So what? So what?" That's the quote. How do you square that?
Yeah, well, look, I think the president's interactions with Mike Pence and his treatment of Mike Pence and the attempted pressuring of Mike Pence were not a good day, not a good episode, and not a good way to have treated the aftermath and to have treated Mike Pence and what his job was on January the 6th. I disagree with the way Trump handled that. And in the aftermath of all of that, I would remind everyone that the Congress, in a bipartisan fashion, has updated the Electoral Count Act to clarify exactly what the vice president's role is in counting the Electoral College. So I agree with Frank. I think if we spend all month talking about January 6th, it's a net negative for Donald Trump. But as I said earlier, I think people who want to be against Trump over this issue have long since made up their mind on that. And I'd be surprised if someone were switching their vote because of a new filing when a lot of what we know today is sort of generally the perceptions we've had since it happened.